Daniel chapter 2. We'll be over there in just a few moments. Good to be with you this morning. Thankful for each one here. With the, just a quick PSA, with the singing this evening, I believe something was sent out in the ladies group about a newer hymn, or at least new to many, that will be led tonight. I also sent an email out yesterday for those that had listed their email on the website. So there's a link to a couple recordings there and also the sheet music. You just want to familiarize yourself with that, then that would be a good thing. And if you didn't get that, then please let me know if you do want that. I'll be happy to get that to you. We're going to be looking mainly at the book of Daniel this morning, specifically 1 through 6, which is more of the narrative aspect of Daniel, and I thought it would be appropriate at the beginning of a new year to look at an individual who lived in a foreign land for most of his life. He was ripped out of his home country at a very early age and lived, really, as far as we can tell, the rest of his life in a land that did not know God. And Daniel is one of the most practical Bible examples for many reasons. One reason is that we do get a glimpse of nearly every stage of his life, from a teenager, it would seem, all the way into his 80s, whether that's mid-80s or even late 80s. And what I want us to observe this morning is that Daniel kept his faith and his holiness not only throughout each stage of his life age-wise, but he kept it in a constantly changing world. Different kings that came in, different world powers that came about, but one thing that never changed was his relationship with God, even when the environment he was living in was not friendly toward God. There were sometimes circumstances that allowed Daniel to live comfortably and even thrive in that environment. And we'll talk about some of those things. But it wasn't always the case. Of course, we remember with Nebuchadnezzar that at a point Nebuchadnezzar came to acknowledge God, but then he fell back into his own pride and then fell back toward God again. But it was never consistent, especially it wasn't consistent for Daniel. It was constantly changing. And so again, I think it's helpful for us to look at this at the beginning of this year, especially with a lot of things that are about to happen in this country in the next couple of weeks with change. This world is constantly changing. We live in a constantly changing cultural landscape. And this world has nearly always been hostile towards God. That has not changed. What we don't want to do is search the web, search social media, and anywhere else for what culture is doing and saying, well, what's everyone else doing right now? That's the litmus test. That's what we want to go along with. No, we might even look to the religious community at large. We might say the conservative community. I'll just say those beliefs are constantly changing as well. We don't look to that. What I want us to look at is a character from the Bible who lived righteously, who lived godly in an ungodly world. Now, one brief thing that I want to do, and by the way, this is probably familiar material for the teens here. This is several months ago. I did an adaptation of some of this material, but hopefully it'll be different enough and maybe long enough away that this is still helpful for them. But certainly this will be helpful for all of us. Looking at a few periods of Bible history here, we come over to Daniel chapter 1 and in verse 1. And it reads there, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And we continue down through there and we find that Daniel is one of the ones that's taken in this first group, this first group of captivity. And this would have been, as the slide indicates, around 606 or 605 BC. And we go over to the history books in 2 Kings and Chronicles as well, that Judah, during this period, even with this first group taken, still continues to have kings. They still exist to a certain point. They certainly aren't as strong as they used to have been, but they are still there. Well, then we come to 597 BC, and this is when Babylon comes again, and a second group is taken. Daniel's taken in the first group, then we have the second, Ezekiel, the prophet. We remember Ezekiel, he's taken in this number. And Ezekiel, his message at this point is to the people, you guys need to get comfortable. We're not going anywhere for a long time. Don't think about escaping. Don't think about rebellion. You need to build your houses, have kids, have grandchildren, because 70 years we are going to be here. And Ezekiel is having to convince the people of that reality while they're still pointing to the temple, which is still standing. Because they believe as long as we have the temple, God is with us. God's somehow going to bring us back at this point, and all's going to be okay. Well, 586 comes around about 10 years later, and we have the third group taken, and it's not only the third group that is taken, but in the midst of that, the city and the temple itself is destroyed. So now Ezekiel's message is, don't lose hope. This isn't the end of our nation. God is going to see his promise through. We're not going to be here forever. Yes, we're going to be here for 70 years, but you still need to be teaching your children and your grandchildren about the God of heaven so that when they return, they will be a remnant that knows God. And then, of course, we come to 536 BC. King Cyrus there of Persia releases the captives, lets them return to Jerusalem. Zerubbabel and Joshua, or Jeshua as he's called, return to the land. And when that first return takes place, Daniel is still in captivity. He is still in the land. He's in Babylon, or he's in now under the reign of King Darius of Persia, who comes after Cyrus. So Daniel is at least in his 80s at this point. And that man is the one that is thrown into the den of lions, still having his faith. And so thinking about all of the events with Daniel, as we're going to look at many of them this morning, Daniel is likely not a part of that remnant that returns to Jerusalem. He stays in captivity, he dies in captivity, but still faithful to God, even in that foreign land. And so, coming back to him being a very young man, whether he's 13 or 19, he is that young man that's ripped away from his homeland. He's taken to this faraway place, and I did the math at one point. We're here in Woodstock. If you go all the way to Philadelphia, that would be about 900 miles away, and that's about how far Daniel went from Jerusalem to Babylon. But this is a nation that not only doesn't understand the God of Judah, they frankly don't even care. They look at Daniel and they look at the people of Judah as just another nation in a long list of nations with insignificant gods and insignificant kings. Because after all, they're captives. From the text we have, Daniel never caves to that reality. In spite of what others might think about his God, he knows the God that he serves. He doesn't compromise. He also doesn't just grin and bear it. He doesn't just say, well, I'll put up a good front, but meanwhile, man, I hate these guys, and I'm going to do everything I can to usurp them, to undermine them, and so forth. He exceeds all expectations in every phase of his life, and he maintains his integrity. I want us to look, I asked you to turn to Daniel chapter 2 a moment ago. Here in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 20, this might be a good summation of Daniel's attitude during all of his time in a foreign land. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand." I want us to notice here, particularly in this text, that Daniel's focus is entirely upon God. He gives all of the glory, all of the credit to God. And what we're going to see throughout Daniel's life is that focus never shifts. He maintains that focus, and he remains steadfast in his faith. So let's look at some of Daniel's faith. First of all, I want us to notice that he made full use of his God-given gifts. We go over to chapter 1. We'll be over there in just a moment. One of the phrases, or I guess it's really more of an acronym that you'll hear, especially for those that are applying for college or have applied for college recently, you'll hear the phrase DEI. And that's not just in the college landscape, but that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Equality is certainly a major focus of our society, of our culture today. And what those individuals would say is that everyone needs to have the same level playing field. Everyone needs to have the same advantages, the same opportunities, and so forth. We all need to be at the very same exact starting point. Well, we come to Daniel. Daniel has some advantages, but he also doesn't have some other advantages. Again, he is already in a foreign land. He doesn't speak the language. He doesn't worship the same gods. He doesn't even have, as we see in chapter 1, the same dietary routines that the ones that are forcing that on to him do have. But he does still have some advantages. Chapter 1 and verse 3, "Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans." So we might describe Daniel as having the full package, right? He's, as we might say, the brain and the brawn. He's got the looks, but he's also got the smarts. We see also briefly what we've already read, that Daniel is probably of noble birth, a prince of Israel, I think some translations say. And talking about these recruiters here, whoever they are, they're looking for what? They're looking for very surface level, shallow characteristics to bring these individuals into the king's court. Why? Because that makes the king look better. When you got good-looking people, you got smart people around you, makes the king look better too. So these individuals, these worldly individuals, might be shallow, but Daniel's not. Daniel might have those advantages, but that's not all that he's made up of. Okay? One of the things preached in our culture today is if you have these advantages, especially if you're of a certain demographic or of a certain race or a certain class of people, then that's a privilege. And you need to check that privilege. Well, we see here, Daniel doesn't do that. He does have certain advantages. He doesn't say, I don't want to be a part of this select group of people. I don't want that privilege. Take me out of this group. I don't belong here. I don't want to be a part of this. No, he recognizes those advantages and he uses them for God's glory. Really, as we're going to see, by just being a good employee. Though that's not exactly what's going on here, but that's maybe how we would think of this interaction. And that's going to take place both under Babylonian rule and Persian rule. He's going to maintain that attitude. We come down to verse 17 of chapter 1. As for these 4 young men, talking about Daniel and his friends here, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So Daniel and his friends, they are blessed with wisdom, they're blessed with skill. What do they do with it? They use those things to the very best of their ability. We remember what Ecclesiastes 9 in verse 10 says. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. But specifically here, Daniel is doing that to give credit to God. We're especially going to see that in chapter 2. Coming over to chapter 2, looking at verse 48, Daniel, through his life, because of the gifts that he has, the God-given gifts, he gets some positive attention from that, but he also gets some negative attention. But here in verse 48, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So here, this is a positive for Daniel. He's promoted. What this sometimes means with Daniel having his gifts, and even his friends, is that they do such a good job with what they've been given that attracts negative attention from others that are also kind of competing in the same grouping that they are. They don't like all the positive things that are happening to Daniel and his friends, so they want to tear him down. They do not care. Daniel and these other friends do not care what other people think of them. As long as, and this is important, we talk about, I don't care about what other people think of you. That's true to a certain extent. Only as long as we're doing God's will. If we're acting up, if we're rebelling and so forth, I don't care what people think of me, that's the wrong attitude. We need to make sure we are in line with God. Whether we face a fiery furnace or whether we face the lion's den, we must not care what the world thinks as long as we recognize that God is king and we are his servants and we're living as such. Now, as we see here, we've already read in verse 48, this is a positive. Even in chapter 1, they receive praise from the chief of the eunuchs. Nebuchadnezzar gives them praise at times. But really, that's just a byproduct. That's not what they're after. That's not what their main goal is. Colossians 3, and in verse 23, Colossians 3 and verse 23 reads this way. Whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. That's the boat that we're in as Christians. We serve men, but we don't just serve men to serve men. We do so to the Lord. So in an unstable environment, which Daniel certainly was a part of and his friends were as well, they were the most stable, even amidst all the instability. And in doing so, when they were that picture of stability, others could look at how they were living their lives and say, I want some of what they have. And it's not the looks, it's not the intellect. What they had was a living God. And they could point others to that same living God, as they tried to do many times. Well, what Daniel also did, and we've looked at some of this, is that he gave God the glory. Coming over to chapter 2, we'll be there in just a moment. Here, Daniel has an opportunity to do something that no one else can do. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he says, guys, I don't only want you to give me the dream, I want you to give me the interpretation also. So normally what would happen is Nebuchadnezzar would give these individuals the dream and say, what does this mean? Well, they can come up with anything and he can believe that. But no, he says, I don't just want the interpretation, I want you to give me what the dream is. And if you don't, you're all dead. You're all dead. Daniel is able to interpret the dream. He's also able to know what that dream is. And now he's about to come before the king with that interpretation, with the dream. And he knows that he's the only one that is able to do so. All these others have failed. He knows where he got this information from. And he also knows that he's probably going to be rewarded for this effort. So we come to Daniel chapter 2, and looking there at verse 27. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this, and he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. Daniel doesn't say, there's no one else that could do this but me. He says, there is no one else that could but God. There is a God in heaven who makes these things known. So, and he even brings that up. When others simply just look at the intellect, which no doubt Daniel had, Daniel says, that's not how I got this. Don't look to me, look to God. God is the one who gave me this wisdom. When you have people who are blessed with good gifts that are from God, but they fail to thank God, to recognize where those gifts came from, what do you have? You have a bunch of arrogant, prideful people, and you end up with the culture that we still have today, and the culture that Daniel lived in. And so now with, checking your privilege and all that sort of language, you have people pushing back against that, saying, you're only successful because of someone else. Christians, and Daniel, but us today, Christians should be the first in line to say, yes, I am successful because of someone else. And it is God. He is the one that has given me these gifts. And that's who I'm going to point to. Not I, but God. Not I, but Christ. Well, Daniel was also, he used discretion and discernment. We've already noted that Daniel is staying true to his God. He's remaining faithful. He does not compromise. But he also does not go about doing so in this kind of stuck-up, haughty, prideful sort of way. He doesn't try to get under the skin of his captors or of his superiors. I will note, and we're going to see this, that it does happen. But Daniel's not trying to do that. That's not his goal. Look at, going back to chapter 1, Daniel 1 in verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And I think I want to be, well, I've got the wrong verse up there. What I'm looking for, maybe that's what I'm looking for. Yeah, coming down to 2 in verse 14. No, let's see. Sorry about this. Got some of my notes jumbled up here. Let's read down through verse 16. So chapter 1 and in verse 9. We already read verse 9, but verse 10. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So the eunuch is worried here that if they don't abide by this regiment of eating, that he's going to lose his head. And I want us to notice here, we note many times in verse 8, he purposed in his heart that he was not going to defile himself with the king's delicacies. But how Daniel goes about doing that, I think, is also important. He does not come into this scene, guns blazing, saying, I don't care if you shove it down my throat, I'm not going to bend to what you're trying to do here. Daniel, again, had made up his mind that he was going to abide by what God says, not these other men, but he approaches it from the aspect of, here's another option. Could this be possible? Let's do a trial run, 10 days. Let's see what happens. Now, I believe that if at the end of that 10 days, the eunuch and his supervisor said, nah, we're not trying your way. We're going to go with the king's way. Then Daniel would probably have to approach things a little differently. But not at this point. He approaches his direct superior with respect, with tactfulness. And if not, you think about his friends and the others that were in this boat. Could have gotten his friends in trouble too. You think Daniel's thinking about that? I think so. So he's not rude, he's not hostile, but he's also not compromising truth. And that is also important. But coming over to chapter 2 and in verse 14, this is where I was wanting to go a minute ago. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. The LSB, and I think even the New American Standard, uses the phrase discretion and discernment, those two words at the beginning of verse 14. So he used caution, he used carefulness. He was not seeking to bolster himself in any way, get everyone else killed. He was using tactfulness. As this order had been made now in chapter 2, that all the wise men are going to be killed. That would have included not only just the magicians and the astrologers of all these other places, but also, as they would be named, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When fewer and fewer people agree with our beliefs as Christians, it's going to become even more crucial that, as Paul says in Colossians 4 and verse 6, we use or have our speech seasoned with salt. In Ephesians 4 and verse 15, speaking the truth in love. Again, we're not compromising truth, but we're presenting it in a certain way. And we're going about it in a certain way, using discernment. Our goal Our goal with the world and people of the world, even in the religious community, is not to get someone's blood boiling. It's not to get under their skin. It's to get through to them. It's to get through to their heart so that they might change and they might also follow the God of heaven. Well, again, there's some overlap with all of these points, but he was also subject to the authorities of his day. Coming over to chapter 4, and in verse 19, chapter 4 and in verse 19, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. So Daniel is troubled here. The king notices that. And here he's concerned for the king Nebuchadnezzar. He was astonished, he was troubled, he was appalled, all different words in different translations. And he says, King, if only the dream was about someone else, one of your enemies. I wish that. That's not the case. Daniel is saying this about the man that is responsible for ripping him out of his homeland, destroying the city, and railing against the God of heaven. And Daniel says, O king, I wish it not be so. When Daniel has the interpretation of you're going to be a beast of the field, he does not say, finally, he's going to get his just deserts. He's getting what's coming to him. He doesn't come in with a mischievous grin. He's dismayed. He's troubled. He does not want this to happen. You remember, and we're not going to go into all the detail of this, but of course in Romans 13, we're told there, Paul goes through there, that we are to be subject to the authorities. Give honor to Caesar. Yes, to Caesar you give honor. Daniel has the same attitude with King Nebuchadnezzar here. You know, we think about this in terms of our politics today and the culture that we live in today. Be subject to the authorities. This is true. But we think about this in Romans 13. We don't have a Domitian. We don't have a Nero in our country. And yet, don't we see so many bemoaning whichever leader is in power today in our country? Yes, there is injustice, not discounting that. But certainly it's not at the level that Paul lived under, that Daniel lived under. Daniel was not that guy. He wanted what's best for all, and he was subject. Over in chapter 6, and in verse 21, Daniel 6:21, then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. We remember what Daniel 6 is about. This is the lion's den, that famous story. And he had just been thrown in. He's about to be released. O king, live forever. Now Daniel is under a new nation, a new king. How is he able to utter that phrase in the midst of the one who had just signed off on his death sentence? I'll tell you how. It's because his focus was not on who was in power, was not upon himself. His focus was upon God. The governing authorities, they are also under the power of God, and God allows them to be there. Daniel recognized that. In the midst of that also, he would not forsake his relationship with God. Over in Daniel chapter 1 and in verse 8, coming back to the first chapter, we've mentioned this already. Here he uses wisdom, he uses discretion. He does not compromise his faith or his relationship with God. And no matter what, he was not going to defile himself with these delicacies. He's going to use tactfulness, but if all fails, he's not going to compromise. Well, we come over to chapter 3, and here, this is where we kind of take a break from Daniel for a moment, and we look at his friends. Here they're named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they don't know if in the midst of them refusing to bow down to this idol, if God is going to save them from the fiery furnace. They know that he's able to, but they don't know for sure if he's going to. Chapter 3 and verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. They're still not willing to buckle. It has come to the point with these three individuals that tactfulness has gone out of the window. They say, O king, we're not going to do this thing. We serve the God of heaven, and we know that he's capable of saving us, but even if not, we're not going to do it. There is no other answer here from these individuals but God. God is the only answer that matters. Well, coming back to chapter 6, here in the midst of the lion's den, in verse 10, chapter 6 and verse 10, Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since the early days. When Daniel knew that this document had been signed, he prayed still more. And don't you love that phrase at the end? As was his custom since the early days. It wasn't going to change. The law changed. He said, I'm just going to go back to what I've been doing since I got here. God is still the same, even in the midst of nations changing, laws changing, kings changing, people changing. Daniel's relationship also remained the same. Daniel also consistently spoke what was true. We've noted some of this already. In chapter 4 and in verse 27, 4:27, he says, Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. So Daniel, we've already noted this, does have honor and respect for the king, but he says, you're in sin, and you need to turn from that. You have iniquities. You need to stop those. He doesn't sugarcoat what the king needs to do in order to be saved. And some, no matter how respectful we might be, they're not going to change. That is true. But we've got to give them the truth nonetheless. Daniel is not afraid of that. We're reminded of the story, the account over in Mark chapter 6 of John the Baptist talking with Herod, who has his brother's wife. John wasn't afraid of giving the truth either. And that cost him his life in the end. In chapter 6, again in verse 22, we read a little earlier than this already in verse 21, but verse 22, My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. So he doesn't let Darius off the hook here. He says, I didn't deserve this. You did me wrong. I survived, but you ought not have done this. So Daniel was very much a part of the culture of the day, but he was also living in stark contrast to it. He didn't make the truth more palatable just because it was true. Well, again, Daniel's world changed constantly. But he did not change in his faith, nor did his God. I want to read a few verses from Psalm 102, if you want to turn over there. In Psalm 102, and in verse 25, Psalm 102, 25. Of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will endure. Yes, they will all grow old like a garment. Like a cloak you will change them, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. God does not change. The gods of each nation that Daniel served under, they changed. Daniel was always the same in his faith. And brethren, that's how we deal with the turmoil that we might deal with in our lives. There are many gods that we have in our world today. Money, jobs, popularity, list goes on. Those things are always going to be in flux. They're always going to be changing about what's the best new thing. What we need to focus on is not the ever-changing landscape, but the God who does not change. Because God is the only one that can bring stability in instability. Because if we don't hold to God, then the changing landscape is going to be a very bumpy ride. And we're not going to know where to turn. We're not going to know what to do. We remember the parable that Jesus gives of the wise man and the foolish man. How are you building? Are you building on the rock, on Jesus Christ, or are you building on the sand, which is sinking low? You have an opportunity this morning, each of us do, to reflect upon what's been done for us by God through His Son, Jesus Christ. That sacrifice has been made for each one of us. And for those that have not put on Christ, you have the opportunity this morning to do so. Put Him on in baptism, begin that walk. Have that stability. Maybe you've gone after other things, you've found that this world indeed is shifting. It does not bring that stability that you thought it did. You can come back to God, you can come back to Christ this morning. So if you have that need, I want you to come as we stand and as we sing.